Hey folks, if you're a fan of Vampire Survivor, today's episode might look familiar given I'm going to be talking about Joychasing Games' Bullet Heaven: Return to Abyss. This will, I'm fairly sure, be the first title from that genre I'll be tackling on the channel, at least in recent memory, so it'll be interesting to find out if this bullet-heavy blitz was a blast, or if this bullet heaven was a hellish experience. I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Without warning or even reason, Aurora, a former archangel, found herself revived. Except, what greets her is not the world she once knew, but a nightmarish plane of chaos. And that's about all you get for the main narrative points, since you're about as clueless as she is regarding the circumstances of her resurrection or why she's wound up in a demon-infested plane that's undergoing some sort of entropic calamity. Beyond that, the only other plot point dangled in front of you at the start is the seemingly arbitrary appearance of a cafe in the middle of the abyss, which, thanks to the hospitality of its staff, winds up being your hub area. Suffice to say, once you've gotten out of the tutorial, you're more or less on your own, narratively speaking, save for a few brief bits of dialogue you can eke out of the NPCs as you progress through the playthrough. But at the end of the day, they're still fairly shallow slices of storytelling, and it won't be too long at all until the dialogue starts to loop. Admittedly, whenever you unlock an additional character, they do begin to show up at the bar with their own dialogue elements which provide a bit of backstory, but even those are fairly minimalistic and retain the same problem as the former story elements. There also doesn't seem to be much overlap between any of them, despite all existing in the same place. So by the time I'd reached 16 hours of playtime, I felt like I'd outpaced anything narratively relevant. Which means it's about time to get started on the mechanics, and frankly, it is a bit of a slow start. Like other Vampire Survivor likes, you can't actively aim, so the first chunk of every stage is a careful dance as you try to maneuver your character and their weapons near enemies to whittle down their health and acquire experience, without getting killed by them in turn. This goes on the longer the stage progresses, with different monsters cropping up in larger numbers and more frequently. Every so often, a larger than normal monster pops up to ruin your day, or cough up a crate containing another weapon or weapon upgrade, or even mini-bosses. And as you might expect, each stage culminates in a boss fight, whose appearance is more tied to time than any sort of body count you might accrue. On the whole, it's a simple enough design, but there are some fun quirks to be found here. For instance, the weapons feel distinct enough insofar as how they function and the optimal way to wield them. Something which is then further compounded because whenever you level, you're given a choice between a weapon-specific perk and a God's Blessing. The weapon perks are exactly what they sound like, a collection of run-specific upgrades to weapon that might increase its size, causes projectiles to multiply on hit, ramp up damage, or even inflict status effects like poison, burning, or damage down. They're legitimately neat additions to your kit, and given that you can equip up to 6 per weapon, you can craft some fairly interesting loadouts, especially once you start customizing the pool of upgrades you can find at the hub. That said, the most important changes to your offensive options comes in the form of divine blessings, which are themed around the colored gods. Tyr, for instance, provides red blessings, which tend to be related to health, regeneration, or even revenge, since he can cause you to dish out the damage you take, albeit greatly boosted. There's also blue or green talents, which can do things like provide control effects which slow enemies, or even grant you shields. There's also a late game pair you'll eventually unlock with money-related gold blessings and more utility or progression-oriented black boons. The interesting part here, though, is that each weapon has 3 blessing slots, which determine how a weapon will evolve when you grab a weapon crate while at full slots. A mixed number of blessings will push the weapon towards its default evolved state. That said, each weapon also has a form based on its affinity being completely devoted to a singular god. These can be vastly powerful additions to your loadout, though they can also be fairly problematic, given that they substantially change up how a weapon works to such a degree that while certain upgrades will flourish with the newly evolved weapons, others will be outright cancelled, and no, they aren't refunded. Still, as long as you pay attention to the weapon perks and the UI warnings for what blessings they're incompatible with, it's not too hard to plan ahead. At least on that front. On the weapon perk side of things, it's not quite as good at warning you when specific blessings are incompatible with each other, save in a few cases where specific unique perks remove each other from the pool. It's also fairly vague about how a number of them work in general, which can be tricky when you're trying to figure out which ones to grab. Also, while your armory does let you track which blessings you've already unlocked, and to even remove some from the pool to facilitate certain combos cropping up and weapon evolutions, it's not as forthcoming about the statistical differences between those forms, leaving you with just a small tagline for what they bring to the table, or manually checking their stats at the pause screen while you're already using that weapon in the middle of a level. Still, it is an interesting system, and the fact that each unlocked character adds their weapon to the pool means you have a gradually growing arsenal to mix and match, which in turn is complemented by the various passive abilities each character has. While these are initially minimal, they do gradually expand as you accrue influence, a sort of experience that unlocks more passives for characters. Or it would, were it not for the fact that acquiring influence is wildly arbitrary. I could go hours of playing the game with only a threadbare gain on a single character. While sometimes this could be chalked up to an early death, there were times where I cleared a stage and gained 0 influence. Putting close to half an hour to make no progress makes the grinding feel tedious, especially since the gains are already rather negligible. It would almost be understandable if I was using the drink system, given there is a fairly nifty array of modifiers you can apply to the maps with a mix of bonuses and penalties that change the maps, which I would use, but they disable influence game and achievements, the latter of which you need to gain in order to unlock new areas and content. So I generally avoided using that system like the plague. You're essentially punished for experimenting with it, which also means then me not gaining any influence is just something I don't understand and I hate it. Really, the only time I got to dabble with drinks was to tackle the game's nightmare mode, given it can drop the rarest tier of accessories, items which can provide some legitimately interesting modifiers to your character, like doing more damage the larger your attacks are, or damage on hit based on an enemy's max health. It also helped that you can break down accessories you don't want into parts you can use to upgrade the actually good ones. So yeah, great stuff. Nightmare mode is just living up to its name and being a nightmare for how tanky enemies get. Still, as unreliable or as fiddly as some of these options may be, the meta upgrades you can purchase in the hub for gold are at least reliable. Some of these boosts are essentially on par with a weapon perk when maxed out, albeit applying to all of your weapons. Others, however, represent some staggeringly powerful boosts to your survivability and utility, like extra move speed, max health and regeneration, and they generally are able to be accrued at a decent enough pace given a combination of upgrade support, more gold gained, the mission board quests, and just playing the game. I suppose the only other notable bit of customization you can get is attendance, but they mostly represent a support character you can equip who uses a skill every so often. It's nice, but given they generally require a substantial bit of grinding due to the achievements associated with gaining them or clearing enough of the game and finding a hidden item, it can be a very long time until you see even one. So, when I said things are off to a slow start, I wasn't exaggerating. At this point, I've actually reached 18 hours of active playtime, piled through 5 out of 6 stages, and the only thing I can really say is I feel exhausted. On one hand, I can definitely appreciate that each of the stages has their own quirks in regard to the obstacles they provide, to the point they feel more interesting the further you progress, such as the swamp tendrils in Area 3, the darkness and tight confined passages of Area 4, and Area 5, minute looping area where you can suffocate because space! They also all have their own enemies, behaviors, arrangements, and bosses that really help to add a bit of life to the experience and uniqueness. That said, there are also elements that simply didn't feel fun. A few enemies will simply kill you dead if you haven't upgraded your speed enough or had the misfortune of picking a slower character, since you can find yourself encountering enemies who can and will obliterate your health in seconds without any avenue of escaping them. Mission 4 especially took me a substantial amount of preparation to create a loadout with just that boss in mind, and then I got zero influence for killing that motherfucker. So yeah, it felt nice to test some of the wilder loadouts against the worst of what a level had to offer, but other times I found myself weary because I was at yet another hour of puttering around in a stage and cobbling together just enough to progress a little bit further and maybe make a little more progress. Yeah. Still, as much as I'm burnt out on gameplay, I've yet to talk visuals, and I will admit a certain degree of fondness for Return to Abyss. First off, the designs for the characters are lovely, whether it's the general appearance or portraits of the NPCs, the hub, or the various protagonists. In fact, I was legitimately fond of the alternate character costumes and the manner in which they changed up how a character looked during combat. And on that front, I also found myself appreciative of the enemy design, especially in regard to the mini-bosses and bosses that crop up during the stages. What's more, though the screen can get a bit cramped, I wasn't wholly overwhelmed typically, which speaks volumes to the game's ability to make proper use of telegraphing. Really, the biggest issue visually is the fact that occasionally you'll find yourself getting caught on unseen bits of the environment while the screen is a solid swarm of enemies. Lastly, the music's legitimately decent. In fact, I'd go so far as to say some of the areas and boss themes are quite good, though the overall stage length means you'll be able to get a bit worn down by them as time goes on, especially since the transitions from certain themes aren't always the best. In any case, it's about time to sum everything up, so let's get to it. Now, initially, I had a bit of trouble getting into the swing of things, with some of the mechanics feeling a bit awkward to figure out. That said, once I gained a better awareness of how the weapon evolution system worked, as well as its interactions with the perks you acquire during a run, and scooped up a few key upgrades in the meta tree, I started to have a lot more fun. Yes, I was disappointed by the fact that there wasn't much on a narrative level to get invested in beyond very brief bits of dialogue with the characters you unlock. That said, there was a fair amount to do gameplay-wise. Exploring all the weapon evolutions did take a fair amount of time. That said, this sense of discovery was the primary bit of entertainment I had to look forward to. While the mechanical progression started to pick up on some levels, in other facets, it felt hampered, such as the character influence being punishing and arbitrary, or accessories being another grind. The meta upgrades you buy with gold are at least semi-constant, but their existence also served to disincentivize picking up characters to a certain extent, given that said characters had difficulty advancing, which meant you were picking up potential dead weight. I still did it, but so many wound up collecting dust because of how slow advancing them felt. All in all, Return to Abyss has some interesting mechanical elements at its core, but it distinctly feels like it could use more polish insofar as their execution, especially for a game that asks you to replay its levels as much as it does, despite not doing much to change up how they feel between the countless iterations. Ultimately, I stepped away feeling like it was a fumble, something which felt unsatisfying to me, but which may still appeal to someone who's a fan of Vampire Survivor or other bullet heavens and is looking for something to fiddle with. I am really burnt out, and I do not see myself returning to this game. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or just want to support the channel, maybe get yourself in the credits. Also to my merch house for neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs. But yeah, that said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.